And we are live. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to A Bookish Moment. I am your solo host for today. JC sends his regards from a offsite field trip at his day job. So you're here with me, Sarah Burr, as we chat with the wonderful Lynn Bohart, who is joining us once more to chat about her writing world. Lynn, welcome back. It's so good to see you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm thrilled to be here. This is great fun.
We're going to have a lot to catch up on because since you were last here chatting about your Old Maids of Mercer Island series, you have undertaken a really, really cool initiative that honestly, like when I think about it, I'm like, why haven't I thought about this before for my own characters? Because it's such a cool concept. So I can't wait to dive in on your newest book, Case of the Missing Will. But before we do that, I'm wondering if you'd like to kind of just give our viewers who may be meeting you for the first time or need a refresher in the year since you've been here about a little bit about yourself, your writing history, and the Old Maid series.
So I spent 35 plus years in the nonprofit world as a professional executive director and began writing probably 15 years ago, maybe, and started with, I've always loved mysteries. I've always loved ghosts. So I started with a paranormal detective series many, many years ago. And then from that, decided that I wanted to try my hand at a snarky kind of cozy mystery. I really like Janet Ivanovich and her snarky books that she writes. And so I created the Old Maids of Mercer Island, which has become very popular. And now, because I think the last book that I wrote in that series, there's 6 books in that series, was No Place Like Home for a Murder. I think the poster is behind me. And that's what we talked about last year.
Yep.
And so I'll explain later why it was because of something in that book that prompted me to start this whole new series.
Yeah, that's exciting. I love how a writer mind works, because it could be just like the littlest thing that sends us in these wild, fun directions.
Well, I should mention too that I also taught writing, crafting the story for 10 years or so through one of the local community colleges, and now have moved into book coaching and manuscript review. So, we can chat about that later. But yeah, let's talk about the Unstoppables.
I love that they have their own name. Number one, I think that every sleuthing crew needs their own special moniker. So I love that Julia and the Unstoppables exist.
Well, in fact, here's the cover of the book. So, it's funny because when I published it, I wasn't sure if the Unstoppables should be part of the title. And I decided that Unstoppables would be almost like the genre in a way, or it's the series, and then each title. I was a big Nancy Drew reader, and you mentioned earlier that you were too. And if you'll remember, a lot of them was the case of the broken clock, the case of the whatever. So I'm purposely doing that with these books. So this first one is the case of the missing will. The second one is going to be the case of the deadly secret, and I don't know what the third one's going to be, but I'm going to do at least 3 in this series.
I was going to ask, as soon as I saw number one is I saw the title and then the cover, because the cover also kind of invokes some of that Nancy Drew vibe. I'm thinking of the Curse of Blackmore Manor, and this this
Good memory.
like different, just like different, it's like Blackwood Hall. Like there's just like so many like cool silhouettes of buildings.
Yeah.
We also have Mizian in our chat saying how much she loves the cover. I love that it like brings about like that sense of Nancy Drew, because, you know, she's an icon for myself. And I think that like being able to introduce younger readers to like that type of not only sleuth, but just like person in general. Like, I think that that's such like a wonderful thing.
Well, and let me mention about this book cover, because I went to Fiverr. I had a gal who designed all my Old Maids books, and now she's had a baby, and so she's not designing anymore. So I went to Fiverr, which is a freelance site, and this guy specifically kind of focuses on vintage type book covers.
Ooh.
And that's why I picked him, because this book is set in 1965. So just in case people are interested, I know Fiverr sometimes gets a bad rap. I'm a writer. I'm a freelance writer on Fiverr and have done really well, and, you know, have great clients and stuff. But, you know, if they're interested in finding some good book cover designers, there are some on Fiverr.
Yeah, it's always really interesting to see like all the different like resources that we have available to us. When I was starting, I used Upwork to find my cover designer for the original my original Court of Mystery series. And then from there, like connected with editors and proofreaders and such. And so there are these really great marketplaces for folks that are interested in figuring out like, okay, like I've written a book, now what do I do with it? Places like Fiverr, places like Upwork can really help you find the team that you need. So it's good to hear that because the cover is really, really cool. And we've also in our chat have Farmhouse Reader and DHB both saying, we've got Farmhouse Reader saying Tuesday greetings, and DHB says hello. So we've got, thank you guys so much for joining us. We appreciate you being here. Any questions that you have for Lynn as we go along, feel free to drop them in the chat, because the super, super cool thing about Case of the Missing Will is we are taking the characters that we know and love from the Old Maids of Mercer Island, and we're going back in time.
Backwards.
1965. We've got Julia, who is 13 years old, and her brother Ben, who is 16 years old, getting involved in a case in their neighborhood. Mr. Pendleton is dead. What are these? How do these kids?
Mr. Pendleton.
It's like, how do these? Number one, I guess maybe when I was 13 years old, I was definitely trying to search for a mystery like in my neighborhood, because I just wanted to be Nancy Drew so badly.
When I take walks, I look for dead bodies.
Yes.
Okay, so I do too.
You have no idea how many times where I've looked at something or been like, because I take my dog Evie out for a walk, and I'm just like, are we gonna like end up on Dateline eventually?
Is that a foot over there? Yeah, I know.
So tell us, Lynn, number one, how did you decide that, you know what, I love my Old Maids, but now I'm going to write about them as teenagers? Like, that seems like a really, like, how do you get in the mind of a teenager?
Departure. Well, first of all, the Old Maids, just let me, I'll set the stage. The Old Maids is, like I said, based on kind of that Janet Ivanovich snarkiness. And Julia Applegate is the main character. She's smart, she's sassy, but she's also klutzy. Because I love humor, so she's pratfalls all the time, and she's snarky in her head. So she often is thinking something snarky, and then by mistake says it out loud. But she has three best friends, who the four of them are in a book club together and have been in this book club for 10 or 12 years. Mercer Island, I live in the Seattle area, so Mercer Island is a real island up here in the middle of Lake Washington. It's a fairly wealthy area, so when I created that series, I wanted these women to have resources because they're amateur sleuths, right? And in the very first book, one of their book club members at their Christmas party falls face first, dead in her peach cobbler. And I thought that was funny, and so of course, Julia is immediately set up because she made the peach cobbler as perhaps the killer. And so it's the girls begin to solve mystery after mystery after mystery. And they're a hoot. They're in their 60s. They're in their early 60s. I wanted to write about older women, and several of my reviewers have said, thank you for writing about women who aren't dead yet, because they talk about sex. They don't, it's a what I call a next generation cozy mystery, because the crimes are really serious. I mean, the first crime in the first book, In Keeping with Murder, is sex trafficking, which usually isn't in cozy mysteries. And they do swear. They'll say shit and damn. And, usually in cozy mysteries, there is no swearing. So this is why I call it kind of a next generation cozy mystery. But in The Key to Murder, I'll point behind me again, because that's the 5th book in the series. A friend, a school friend of Julia's, actually it's her older brother's, one of his best friends, shows up on her doorstep and dies, falls dead on the floor. His name is Carter. And then in the 6th book, The No Place Like Home for a Murder, Ben has now moved back home. He's a forensic anthropologist, so he's a little bit like Indiana Jones. He's traveling the world, and he's a genius. He's genius level intelligence. And he ends up buying Carter's home, and he comes to Julia's with this box and says, hey, look, Carter was writing a short story. And she looks in the box, and here's this manuscript called Case of the Missing Will. Aha. And Ben jokes with her and says, hey, Julia, you ought to finish it. This was the case that we worked on when we were kids. And she laughs and she says, well, no, first I have to solve Case of the Dead Body in Rudy's Kitchen, because that's what No Place Like Home for a Murder is a homeless woman gets killed in one of her best friend's kitchens. So when I did that, when I had Ben show up with that short story, I started thinking, why don't I write it?
Oh, so you hadn't even made that decision yet. Oh, wow. Okay.
No, and a couple people in my critique group kind of said that too. You ought to write that short story. So I started out thinking it was going to be a short story. And then I thought, well, maybe it'll be a novella. And then it turned into a regular novel. And because these women are in their early 60s, I had to sort of calculate, okay, time-wise, going backwards, what year, would Julia be 12 or 13? And I said it in 1965. And now I'm going to tell all your listeners how old I am, because I was in high school at that time period. And I thought, well, this will be cool. I set one of my Detective Giorgio Salvatore mysteries in 1965. At least the murder was in 1965 at my high school in Pasadena. It was a young girl who on prom night was murdered and dumped into an old well, and her body is found 40 years later. So the entire book is about going back in time to solve that mystery. So I'd been there before. So I thought, well, let's do it again. But now I'd already established that Julia grew up in Wisconsin. And so I set it in a small town in Wisconsin. And because my stories are all paranormal, in the Old Maids, there's a number of funny and helpful ghosts, but one of the funniest is her mother. Her mother dies the year before the first book is written, and she calls Julia on her cell phone, which I remember when I wrote that, I thought, oh my God, my critique group is never going to accept this. And they cracked up. They thought that was hysterical. So now readers of The Case of the Missing Will, obviously Julia's mother is very much alive. So they get to meet her in real time, which so far people have really enjoyed. So that's how this came to be.
love that there is this like such a cool moment of this Easter egg in your Old Maid series where, you know, there's this case of the missing will, and that so much grew out of that, but that you also had to really revisit what you've written to know, like, to be able to pull those threads, because you know, since Julia had we know her backstory somewhat, like you have to build within those confines. I find that I feel like I've done that a couple times when I've done some short stories about characters, and I'll be like, oh man, I really wish I hadn't I really wish I hadn't put this in stone before,
Right.
because I'd like to change things now. And like the point where you talk about Julia's mother actually now being a live character, you know, that it's just like such an enhancement for fans of your current writing, but you have this new audience that you have to work with, because
Right.
it is a novel for teens. You know, you have to kind of play by a different set of writing rules. And DHB has a good comment here about that, saying that that probably we've all used less than perfect language, at least at some point in our lives, especially when someone gets whacked, in reference to like there being swearing in your Old Maid series.
Right.
But I'm assuming that we don't find that in your young adult novels, or do we? Because I don't know. I hear teens talk these days. I'm just like, what is coming out of your mouth?
Yeah. And you know, I remember some of the language back in 65. Most of my friends didn't really swear a lot, but I was able to go back and remind myself of phrases like bitchin' and awesome, and, you know, those kinds of things that the kids use. So I had, in fact, in the beginning of the book, they're having dinner at Julia's house, and Carter is there. So Carter, who died in The Key to Murder, is also very much alive, right? And he's having dinner, and Ben says, "Oh, bitchin', man." And her mother looks at Ben and says, "Watch your language, young man." And Carter jumps in and says, Oh, Mrs. Brower, bitchin' really isn't a swear word. It's just slang." And she cuts him off, and she says, "I know what it means, Carter," and just shuts him up. But that was really fun to kind of be able to go back and say, I told you earlier that I kind of liken this of the kids from Stranger Things to Home Alone. Because a couple, you know, people in my critique group were saying, wait a minute, these kids are doing an awful lot. I mean, they actually dig up a grave in this book. I mean, they're putting themselves in danger. And I said, well, wait a minute. In Stranger Things, which isn't set in 65, I think it's set a little bit later than that.
Yep, I think that's in the 80s.
Those kids were everywhere without their parents, and they were riding their bikes everywhere. And that's what these kids do. You know, the reality is there's no cell phones, there's no internet, there's no DNA, there's no social media. So I had to remember back when, in those days, I'd be out till dark with my friends. My mom didn't worry about where I was. It was sort of like be home by dinner time, you know. It was a different time period. So there's a lot of fibbing that goes on with the kids saying we're going here, but then they're going to Mr. Pendleton's old house. And they do get away with things until the end. I mean, the ending is just great, because the house on the cover is Mr. Pendleton's house, and it almost plays like a secondary character in the book, because the house was built pre-Civil War, so it's got secret tunnels and secret passageways in it, which obviously play a role. And the kids use the house in the end. And then mom and dad are out of town for an anniversary, and then they come home. So it's sort of like, parents are home, and what's going to happen to these kids? And the cops show up, obviously. And I had to have I have a friend of mine who was not only an ex police officer, but he used to run the police academy here in Washington State, and he vets my books for me to let me know how far afield I'm getting when it comes to law enforcement. And I said, okay, Rex, give it to me straight. It's just ridiculous that these kids would get away with all of this. And he said, look, you have some literary license and it's a different time period.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, I think it's okay and I think it plays well. So, it's meant to be fun and adventuresome. And, so I'm kind of pushing the envelope a little bit when it
No,
comes
I
to
mean,
law enforcement.
like think about like the Goonies. Like that, like all of their
Yep.
wild adventures that they went on.
Yep.
That's like totally, totally believable. And we've got in the chat viewer Sawdust saying, "Oh man, don't be late for supper. That was an only once event." Well, and
Yeah.
I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, and a lot of them are about cold cases that are from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, because it was a different time and there was not as much investigative material out there for folks. But there was also that that sense of, if you're not home by 7, maybe I'll be worried. If you're not home by 9 o'clock, no, I'm really, really worried. But I also haven't seen you since you left the house at 6 o'clock in the morning. And it's like, we have no idea what the day transpired for the missing individual. So you're right. It is a different time. And I think that like a lot of, especially in the YA genre, like being able to be like a window into that moment I think is really cool. So I want to clarify something with you, Lynn. On in the Old Maids book, when you mentioned Case of the Missing Will, was there like a qualifier at that point that was like, we solved this when we were, in our teens? Or was it something that it was just like, oh, like our first case together, and then you made the decision of, okay, like they're not going to solve their first case when they're 20 or 30. It's actually going to be when they're 13 and 16.
Yeah, it's more general in the Old Maids book, because at the time I didn't know what I hadn't really thought of doing anything with it, which is good because I didn't lock myself, into anything. Because to be honest with you, I hadn't decided to do this when I wrote the first 6 books, right? So I really don't talk about Julia and her brother solving mysteries when they were young. So, that's something that I've now added, to her backstory. She's very inquisitive. She's the kind of person that I've established her as an adult character, because a lot of people would say, why would she get involved in all these mysteries? It's like she just keeps stepping into the middle of things. And it's because, for her, I tried to create a character that wrong can't win. She's always for the underdog, and she always wants to find justice for whoever has been maltreated. And so she in fact, my tagline became "Be fearless like the old maids," because they just step into things, especially the character Blair, who's a little bit like the Marilyn Monroe figure of, she's 65 and yet she looks like she's 45 and loves men, and she's just impulsive and she just jumps in the middle of things, and she's usually taking Julia with her. So one of the big things in the Old Maids books is that group friendship, that they almost know how to finish each other's sentences. As I said, Julia is klutzy, and in fact, at the end of the first book, In Keeping with Murder, they're going to take their friend's ashes and sprinkle them in Lake Washington, even though it's probably illegal. But so the 4 of them on Christmas Eve step up to the lake, and Julia's got the urn, right? And she takes the top off, and they're all talking. And as she starts to dump the ashes, the other 3 women all back up all at once, because they know what's going to happen. Sure enough, a breeze comes up and blows all the ashes right into Julia's face. So in the Case of the Missing Will, that was the other thing I wanted. Julia's friendships are just really strong. And so what happens is not just her and her brother, it's her and her brother and Carter. And then they recruit 3 or 4 other, 2 football players actually. And her best friend is African American. Keisha, her best friend in the Old Maids book, is an adult woman named April, who's African American. And that was one of the fun things too, because when I was in high school, most white kids didn't hang out with black kids. I had a couple black friends. I sat with black kids at a football game, and I remember other kids staring at me, right? So I thought about that, and I thought, okay, I want to deal with that in this book. And so sure enough, when they go to Mr. Pendleton's funeral, 2 of his students, he was a shop teacher in the junior high and the high school, and it was junior high back then, not middle school. 2 of the black kids show up and sit at the back of, the church and get stared at. And Julie's like, I don't get that. Why are people, they have as much right to be here as anybody. So I try to deal with a couple of social issues. Her aunt comes to live with them because she has an abusive husband. So domestic violence was something back then, nobody ever talked about it. It was always pushed under the rug. Because it was a different time period. So I'm hoping that readers are going to find that interesting too. And then just the fact that how do a bunch of kids solve a mystery when they can't go on social media? They can't, we literally, you couldn't look anything up on the internet. We had Encyclopedia Britannicas back then, which was an entire set of books in your bookcase. These salesmen would come, that was a big thing back then, that they would come around selling families encyclopedias, which were pretty expensive. So it was just fun. It was fun to write, and because I have kind of a wacky sense of humor, and there's a lot of animals in it. There's a Samantha the duck who plays a very important role at the end, and dogs. Dogs are in every one of my books because I love dogs. I have a dog asleep at my feet right now. So I think there's a little bit for everybody in there. That makes sense.
No, it clearly, based on the reviews that you've gotten from your Old Maids readers, like they love seeing
they like it.
This side. So not only is it satisfying to your current readership, but you have this whole new audience to be able to connect with and explore. And I'm really glad that you brought up the point about like having social issues, because I know that in your Old Maid series that you have covered, we talked about the homelessness, in especially like in the Seattle area when you were here with us last. So I'm glad to see that you've found an avenue for weaving those in, even in in a YA novel. So that's really exciting, and like just again like such a amazing like way to explore your characters more. And one thing I would maybe even pose to our audience members, like thinking about all the book series that you've read that are out there, who like. I just think that that's such a cool idea. Like, who would you like to see solve crimes as a younger sense of themselves? So folks in the chat, feel free to give us some responses there. But Lynn, since we are running out of time together, our moment is vastly quickly drawing to a close. But I'd love to know tell us a little bit about your book coaching services, because we have a lot of authors who tune into the show. I know that folks are always looking for good advice, for good feedback, for good critiques. What kind of services are you offering?
If they go to my author website at www.lynnbohart-author.com, they'll see manuscript review and book coaching services. And I would say that I would, for any of your listeners today, give a 15% discount on any of my book coaching services if they just reference this show, Bookish
That's
Moment.
Very
right?
Generous. Thank you.
Yeah. Then, and we can just chat. You can, book a 15-minute free chat with me just to even see if we're a good match. But since I taught writing and crafting the story for so long, it seemed I don't want to be in the classroom anymore. It just seemed like a natural extension for me to go into book coaching, because I love especially working with new writers.
Mhm.
In fact, I'm going to be part of a summit this weekend, a big writing summit called Perfect the Process. And my topic is taking a great idea and turning it into a great story, because I've had so
Cool.
many students that say, Glenn, I've got a great idea. And then they don't know where to go. They don't know even how to start. So I love working with people like that really want to get into, novel writing.
That it's such a valuable service as well, because I think back to when I first started and I didn't know anything. I was just like making my way through, doing my own thing, thinking that it was all going to turn out okay. It's turned out pretty okay, but I definitely would have benefited from sitting down with an expert, understanding kind of what was in store, figuring out the difference, something as simple as between really knowing what your genre is, what your subgenre is, what are some parameters to stay within, the perks of using a pen name versus not using a pen name, all that good stuff. There's so much out there for us to learn. So that's very, very generous of you to offer our viewers a discount on your coaching services. So folks, if you're seeing this and you're interested, feel free to reach out to Lynn. Her website is included in our show notes, and make sure to drop that you saw her here on A Bookish Moment. Because that again, it's such like a valuable just way to spend your time in this community where there's just so much available to us, but hard to figure out where to go.
Well, and as you know, Sarah, so especially I've been in part of a critique group for 12 years. So many of the people that I talk to don't have a critique group. So they don't have anybody really giving them feedback. And sometimes that's all it takes, is somebody who's got more experience than you do, reading what you've written and then just giving you some feedback and some direction. I think it's just enormously helpful.
I couldn't agree more. Being able to at least get somebody's outside opinion before you move forward is 100% the way to go, because as I said, there's so much out there that it's impossible for one person to know everything. Getting other voices involved can really, really help you. So that's a very, very exciting endeavor, Lynn. Congratulations on the launch of your book coaching services. In the remaining minutes, any events, updates, best places for people to keep in touch with you? I know you've got an awesome newsletter that you send out, if you want to tease that a little bit.
I should miss. Thank you. Let's Talk About Murder is my newsletter. People can sign up for that for free on my website. I'm also a big true crime fan, and so I started this newsletter where I interview people who write about. I interviewed Sarah. Her interview is on my website. So people who write about, talk about, or investigate murder. The newsletter that just came out this last weekend, I interviewed a gentleman who he calls himself a man tracker. He's a tracker. He literally tracks people out in the wilderness, and he works with an organization called NecroSearch. I now volunteer with them, believe it or not. And they find clandestine graves to help law enforcement close cold cases. So all my past interviews are up on my website. Just go look at those, and you can sign up for the newsletter for free. So I have, sometimes it's a blog post for me I wrote a blog post on women serial killers, things like that, or the interviews. It's fun. It's
really cool. I mean, you've had a lot of interesting folks on. Really, I love reading the private detectives. Such a cool field, but requires something that I don't have. I was I wish I could do it, but I don't think I don't know. I've got a little bit too much self-preservation. Don't want to put myself in those situations.
You're probably busy enough anyway, Sarah.
Well, Lynn, it's been so wonderful being able to catch up with you and chat about this new endeavor that you're doing with the case of the missing will. You said that there is book 2 on the way. Got a title?
Halfway written.
Ooh, awesome.
Case of the Deadly Secret.
Ooh, I love it.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see the cover for it too, because I think that just like that, you'd mentioned that your cover artist specializes in like that older style.
Kind of vintage. Yeah.
Very, very cool. So folks, make sure that you check out Lynn at her website. You can head to Amazon to get all of her books that are available. Is there another Old Maids coming in the future, or are you?
Oh yeah, there will be. In fact, I kind of set it up in the last book. Because I do focus on social issues. So the next one is going to be focused on murdered and missing Indigenous women.
Oh, okay, yep.
Because that's something that has just that whole concept just bothers the heck out of me, that nobody pays attention to it, and those cases don't ever seem to be solved. So that's going to be the topic for the next book. That
will be very interesting and kind of coincidental that that's what it's going to be, because I've been again to a podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with Somebody Knows Something. But I think it's David Riggin is the producer, but he has gone on and really focused on missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Okay.
And it's talk about something that is just like, it's so sad how neglected these poor women are. And it's very, it's heartbreaking, but also it's like, it seems that we could fix this. It could be a very fixable problem. So let's hope that we see that in our lifetime. But Lynn, thank you so much for being here. It was great,
Sarah. I appreciate it.
Catching up with you. Thank you so much to our wonderful viewers who joined us live for our episode today. If you're watching us after the fact, feel free. You can still comment and we can respond to your questions. And also keep in mind the wonderful offer for Lynn's book coaching services. We will be back with an episode of The Bookish Hour this Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Our guest is Mary Seifert. We're going to be talking about her mystery. So we're having a week of mystery. It's our March Murder Madness, all of that good stuff. So we look forward to catching up with you guys then. Lynn, we hope that you'll stop by a Bookish Moment in the future. And until then, everyone, stay bookish. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks.